Annie Börjesson was looking forward to spending Christmas with her friends and family in her native Sweden. So how did her body end up on a cold, lonely beach? In this episode, we will explore what most likely happened to Annie and the theories behind her mysterious death. On Saturday, December 3, 2005, Swedish national Annie Börjesson left her home in Edinburgh, Scotland and travelled to Prestwick Airport. She had made plans with her friend Maria Jansson to meet up and go Christmas shopping together when she arrived in Sweden, before heading home to spend the holiday with her family. Annie never arrived. The following morning, her lifeless body was found on a beach just over a mile away. According to police, the 30-year-old woman's death had been self-inflicted, but would the evidence prove otherwise? Born on February 7, 1975, to Gillian and Anthony Börjesson, Annie Börjesson grew up in Tibro, Sweden, with her parents and siblings. According to Annie's mother, Gillian, her daughter was fun-loving and adventurous, even as a young girl. When the wind was blowing, she would put her roller skates on because that was when she could go faster. That was the way she lived her whole life. She was curious. She wanted to see and experience things. Music was one of Annie's big loves, and after graduating from music college, she studied hospitality before going on to do a number of customer service jobs. It was in Sweden that Annie met her best friend, Maria. The first time I saw Annie, she was dancing on the table, dressed in a blue dress, and she had her long blonde hair flying loose when she was dancing. She gave a very strong, independent look. It was that independence that led Annie to travel, and in the autumn of 2004 she moved to Edinburgh in Scotland, a country she had fallen in love with during a previous short visit. Annie moved into the Linton Court apartments in the capital, sharing a flat with several other girls. Multilingual with 6 languages under her belt, Annie enrolled on a 6-month English language course, and in February 2005, she began working at the Whisky Heritage Centre on Edinburgh's Royal Mile, where she stayed until August 2005. After a brief visit home to Sweden, Annie returned to Edinburgh with a view to finding a more permanent position in her already beloved Scotland. It was in the Whisky Heritage Centre that she met Kat Dalmo. The two became friends, with Kat remembering Annie as fun-loving, lively and happy, with a love of music and dancing. Hardly surprising, as Annie had inherited her love of music from her father, Carolee, and even sang and played bass guitar in a band called Annie and the Wolves back in Sweden, with her 3 siblings. A love of rugby. Like most people, Annie had a type when it came to dating, and hers was definitely the rugby player type. As an added bonus, she loved the sport as well as its players, so it made sense that she would often go to Murrayfield Wanderers Rugby Club. After all, where better to meet her ideal man? However, it was in a local nightclub called Mood that she met a man who introduced himself as Martin Leslie, a professional and well-known rugby player who had played for Scotland 37 times. While Annie didn't succumb to his repeated invitations to drink, she did enjoy his company, and the pair spent more than 3 hours talking. Annie told Maria later on that Martin had been good company and that he was very interested in why she was in Scotland. In turn, Annie listened excitedly as Martin talked passionately about his rugby career. After enjoying a short visit to Sweden, Annie returned to Edinburgh, having told Maria that she hoped to meet her rugby player again. Bill Fell, the president of Murrayfield Wanderers Rugby Club, recalls meeting Annie for the first time. The night I met Annie was on a Friday night in 2005. She turned up alone and sat at the side of the room entirely on her own. Because she was on her own, I had approached her and said, was she meeting a club member or somebody specific there? She said she was expecting somebody to arrive, so I just left her to it and said, hope you enjoy the evening. Annie later told Maria that Martin had indeed turned up, but that he had walked straight past her without so much as a glance. Annie's hopes that he just hadn't recognized her were dashed when the man stopped, turned around, and gave Annie what she described as a mean look before walking away. Annie quickly changed her mind about him and even told Maria that there was something off and that he had scared her with his behavior, which included him turning up uninvited at the swim club where she was a member. A strong character. Annie was outgoing, fun, and vivacious, and she wasn't afraid to speak out against wrongs. Where she lived, in Linton Court, there was a rule that prohibited guests from being invited to the apartments for making out. Everybody knew this rule, but one flatmate insisted on partying hard and inviting different men back to the apartment. While the other girls were too afraid to confront this girl, Annie had no such fear and pointed out the rules to the flatmate in question. The girl ignored the warning, and when she brought another guest home after a night out, Annie told him the rules and asked him to leave. He apparently was only too happy to oblige, but the flatmate, according to Maria, was furious. But Annie wasn't one to back down from a confrontation if she believed in the cause. Something wasn't right. 2 days before Annie was due to fly home on December 2nd, her family received a call from her, but unusually she was calling from a public payphone some distance from her accommodation. During the call, Annie disclosed that she thought someone was listening in to her phone calls and asked her family not to call her on her mobile phone. Her friend Maria said that Annie also mentioned computers, something about web page addresses. We really don't know why she posed these questions. It was clear to Annie's father and brother that something was bothering their sister and daughter. Still, when Annie arrived at the Whiskey Heritage Centre later that evening to see her friend and ex-colleague Kat, she appeared to be in good spirits. On the Friday I was working an evening shift. I sat down in the staff room and there was a knock on the door. It was Annie just standing there smiling. Hiya. She was in a good mood. She didn't seem depressed at all. She was very happy, and everything seemed to be just normal. Going home. On Saturday, December 3rd, Annie made the journey from her flat in Edinburgh to Prestwick Airport, some 80 miles away. It was assumed that Annie had caught a train from Edinburgh to Glasgow Central Station and a further train to Prestwick Airport. At around 2:15 p.m, Annie tried and failed to withdraw £100 from the ATM in Glasgow, but due to insufficient funds, the transaction failed. According to her bank records, she then tried to withdraw £50, but again the transaction failed. Annie had yet to book her flight home. At 3:14 p.m, Annie crossed a walkway in the airport. Caught on CCTV, she looked unhurried and relaxed as she made her way through the building. Just 2 minutes later, she was seen leaving the airport, using an exit which leads onto a car park. 3 minutes passed, and Annie was seen yet again entering the airport building. This time, however, her demeanor had changed. She was frowning and acting oddly, according to her friends and family. Annie had been planning to fly home that evening and had her passport with her, but whatever took place in that car park during those 3 short minutes changed her mind. Less than 6 minutes after CCTV caught her entering the airport terminal, Annie left the way she had come. There were no more confirmed sightings of Annie Börjesson. However, there were a couple of alleged sightings. At 4:05 p.m, a CCTV camera picked up a figure that could have been Annie, although the image was incredibly blurry, walking along nearby Station Road. As daylight began to fade, the second possible sighting occurred. 2 men who were out walking saw a figure standing on Prestwick Beach, looking out to sea. One of the men, Andrew Montgomery, recalls, "A friend of mine and I were out for a walk, and just when we got about here, a spot on Prestwick Beach, he said to me, 'There's someone out on the sea edge there.' In the gathering gloom, the figure was standing by the water's edge, looking out to sea, not really moving. I think the unusual thing about it was the fact that the person was the only one on the beach. Night was coming on. We just walked on. That was about the extent of what I could bear witness to. It was not possible that I could have identified in that light at that distance that it was a man or a woman, because they were really quite indistinguishable. There's no way that I could have said that was definitely Annie." At 8:23 a.m. the following morning, December 4th, 2005, Annie's body was discovered by a dog walker named David. She was face down in the sand near the seawall, with her bag and coat beside her. The investigation. The detective on duty at the time, Michael Neal, remembers the day well. You've got a young female who's dead on the beach. To err on the side of caution, it was treated as a crime scene. The crime scene manager attended, along with scenes of crime officers who were going to photograph it, but we were in a race against time here to get Annie's body off the beach before the tide was upon us. Her wallet was still there. Her passport was still there. Annie was a Swedish foreign national. We contacted the Swedish police authorities to pass on a death message. Later that same day, Annie's family was informed of her death. Hazel Martin, a journalist looking into the case for the BBC, managed to track down some documents from the investigation, and one such document stated that Annie Börjesson was found drowned in the water at Prestwick, and that the Scottish police suspect there were no suspicious circumstances. That letter was dated December 5th, just one day after Annie's body had been found, with no time for a post-mortem and no time for a thorough investigation. In fact, Annie's body arrived at the mortuary at 10:10 a.m., just 100 minutes after being found. When you take into consideration that the journey to the mortuary takes around 20 minutes, there was surely not sufficient time for the crime scene to be processed with due diligence. Could the police have missed vital evidence that would have made them see her death in a different light? Police say not. Michael Neal, the detective on duty at the time, said, "It wasn't that it was just assumed that it was suicide and nothing was done. There was hours and hours of police work done. There was nothing to indicate that I was dealing with a potential murder. We didn't find anything because there was nothing to find." Another of Annie's Swedish friends, Annie Börjesson, said that the Scottish police said Annie had brought about her own death just within some hours. But what? I know her for 20 years or something like that. No, definitely not. 3 days after Annie's death, a post-mortem was carried out at Ayr Hospital in Scotland. That examination, according to the documentation, found no evidence of significant injuries or trauma and noted that for the most part the post-mortem was marked as normal. The cause of death was recorded as drowning. Back home. Finally, 12 days after her body was discovered, Annie's body arrived back in Sweden. When undertaker Gun Dainberg saw Annie's body, she was shocked at what she discovered. "I have worked in a funeral service for around 38 years. I have never experienced anything like this before. You don't forget. When we opened the coffin, I can still remember seeing finger marks around her neck. 2 marks, I can remember them so clearly." These findings were in direct contrast to what the Scottish police had ruled as normal, with no evidence of significant injuries or trauma. But the differences didn't end there. Gun Dainberg went on. "She had lots of bruises on her body, bruises like someone had hit her or she had been hit by something. On the side with the injured arm, there were also bruises. She had marks on her torso and up towards her hips." Annie's best friend, Maria, also recalls the shock when Annie's family saw her body. The family saw this big bruising from the temple, over her nose and down to the cheek. It was a huge bruising. All these are not mentioned in the Scottish autopsy. Gun added that she couldn't have caused all those bruises herself. There was screaming and crying from her family when they saw her body. Having been told that Annie had taken her own life, the family began to see another possible explanation to her death. Could she have been severely beaten, drowned, and then placed on the beach to make it look like she had done it to herself? Journalist Hazel Martin dug deeper and found that Annie's body had been received by an interim undertaker, this time in London, before being flown home to Sweden. Paperwork described what this undertaker had seen. The deceased was collected from the hospital mortuary and her condition was extremely poor. In respect to her bruises, I can verify that she did have significant bruising to her body, which, for reasons I can't explain, I believe they were not included in the autopsy report. I find this to be quite unusual, considering the circumstances of her death. So what happened between the discovery of Annie's body and the undertaker in London, and subsequently Sweden, finding horrific bruising on the 30-year-old? The existence of such bruising cannot be denied. It was verified by 2 individual professionals in 2 different countries. So why did the Scottish police claim that there were no suspicious circumstances and that Annie's death had been by her own hand? Wanting a record of what they witnessed, the Börjessons took a photograph of the bruising, which was examined by Home Office pathologist Dr. Stuart Hamilton, an expert in death by drowning. He explained that bruising occurs when there is damage to the small blood vessels just under the skin and they leak. The pressure in your blood vessels from the heart beating pushes the blood into the tissue around the damaged vessels, and that produces a bruise. He went on, dead people do not bruise. Having seen the photograph taken by the Börjesson family, he concluded that it looks like a bruise. A bruise is blunt trauma. He went on to say that he would have expected these findings to have been included in the initial report, and the fact that they were not needs to be explained. Something else that needed to be explained was the state of Annie's hair. Annie was very proud of her long blonde hair and had even booked an appointment with her hairdresser, Inga Nosborn, in Sweden when she returned home for Christmas. Her hairdresser was the only person she trusted to touch her locks. But when Annie's family saw her body, they realized that her hair had been cut short. Not just cut, but hacked, with clumps measuring between 5 centimeters and 16 centimeters. Yet when CCTV at the airport had picked her up on the day before her body was discovered, just a few hours before she died, her hair was clearly still long and beautiful. Even more disturbing was the fact that when she was found, there was a bald patch on the top of her head, as if someone had pulled it forcefully out. As Maria said, somebody had desecrated Annie. Her hair was a part of her personality. I mean, where's the rest of her 80 centimeters of hair? Undertakers in London admitted to trimming Annie's hair to make it more presentable, but said that they had only removed between 4 centimeters and 5 centimeters at most. However, when consulted about the case, one of London's leading funeral undertakers remarked, "I have never known hair to be cut. When they do a PM, they do open up the skull, but there is no need to cut hair. For international transportation, a body must be embalmed, but again, there is no need to cut hair. It seems to me very unlikely, as whoever deals with the body would think that the family might want to see it, and so it should be kept as intact as possible." Police tried to claim that Annie had cut off her own hair, and it was something that depressed people often do. Annie, however, did not have a history of depression, according to her family and friends. When Hazel Martin began looking into Annie's case, she submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Scottish police for the photographs which were taken during Annie's autopsy. The reply shocked her. It said that releasing the photographs was not in the public interest, a decision that has confused many of the people involved in Annie's case. Surely releasing the photographs would confirm that everything in their initial report was correct. Or would it? Home Office pathologist Dr. Stuart Hamilton added, "It makes it look like there's something to hide, and that's either poor decision-making or there's something to hide." Case files threw up even more anomalies. When Andrew Montgomery described what he saw on the evening of December 3rd, he clearly stated that he could not tell if the figure standing on the beach was a man or a woman, much less if it was Annie. Yet in a letter sent to the Swedish embassy, the Scottish police wrote, "Someone fitting her description was seen standing at the water's edge, looking out to sea at about 4:30. When Annie's body was returned to her family, the items that had been found with her body were also returned. Annie's mother, Gillian, felt that this was wrong because police had told her the investigation was still ongoing. However, when the family opened the parcel of belongings, they discovered the clothes Annie had been wearing, along with the contents of her bag, including her mobile phone. Still covered in sand, it was clear to the family that the police had not examined the phone at all. Cybersecurity and digital forensics professional Klinger Kieczkowska did examine Annie's phone. She explained that Annie had a basic old-fashioned phone. The SIM card is basically the heart of it. The SIM card would hold information such as, a contact list, a record of calls and messages. The SIM card was never taken out, was never examined, which is really a shame because the data was stored on the SIM card on the phone, not in the cloud. And the return of Annie's belongings threw up yet another question. Where was Annie's Filofax? Annie was well known for taking it everywhere with her, whether that was to IKEA, which was her favorite place to visit when she was home, or a pub or nightclub. She kept a record of phone numbers, contacts, and appointments, and she used it to hold funny pictures, quotes, new words, and anything that she wanted to keep. She also kept a certain amount of cash in one of the pockets. This Filofax was not found on or near her body, and it wasn't in the flat she had paid advance rent on either. So who had it? Annie was also missing the red and white fleece she was seen wearing in the CCTV images. The police maintained that Annie had not been wearing it, but it was visible under her winter coat on the images captured on the day before her body was found. It was never returned to her family and was, just like the Filofax, missing from her flat in Edinburgh. More baffling information was to come. Hazel Martin had a copy of her Swedish police report into the Scottish Police's investigation, which mentioned that the Scottish Police had asked Annie's mobile phone company for her call history, which stated that in the 4 days before Annie's death, she had made no calls whatsoever. What makes it even weirder is that it also said that she received no calls. That claim is known to be untrue because Annie's friend Kat saw and heard her accepting a call from her mother just 2 days before her body was found. Something stuck out in her mind about that call too. Towards the end of the conversation, I remember Annie saying something along the lines of, "Mum, you have to trust me on this one. I have to sort this out by myself." Before leaving Kat, Annie reassured her that everything was fine. This revelation added a whole new level of mystery to an already baffling case. Klinger explained, someone or Annie could have deleted the history, of course, in her phone. However, that would not alter the records that the service provider would have, so either she had a second phone that no one knew about, or the records were destroyed, and that would require a higher authority to command something like that. British political activist and lawyer Amar Anwar added his thoughts. You can't do that if you're a member of the public. It's difficult for the police to do that. The people who can do that, of course, are the security services. When Goya logged on to Annie's Hotmail account, there was no record of any emails either. Whether Annie had erased them or they had been erased by another party, nobody knows. Even stranger, Maria asked her own phone provider in Sweden for a record of all calls that she herself had made in the autumn of 2005. She knew that she had called Annie in Scotland many times during that time, yet her record showed no such calls were made. Hours of conversations with her best friend had simply disappeared. When Maria asked the company's security department why this had happened, they refused to even speak with her. And this is where things become even more sinister. Mistaken identity? Sky News journalist Robert Mulhern was also interested in Annie's case. He discovered that Annie shared her name, Annie Christina Börjesson, with an Emmy Award-winning journalist by the name of Christina Börjesson, who was deeply involved with writing about the American Secret Services. She was something of a fly in the ointment to the CIA and had even lost jobs because of the work she was involved in. At the time that Annie Börjesson is found dead, the American government are relocating prisoners from the Middle East through Prestwick Airport to prisons like Guantanamo Bay. Amar Anwar confirms that if such a journalist was operating in Scotland, the CIA would be keeping a very close eye on her and would more than likely involve more local authorities too. At the same time, Maria had begun receiving multiple silent calls to her mobile phone and also found herself having problems with her email account. Following an email which she sent discussing the fact that Annie could have been mistaken for the journalist of the same name, these calls and email problems intensified to the point where the family and Maria stopped campaigning for answers for a while out of fear for their lives. So what are the theories around Annie Börjesson's death? She drowned herself. Scottish police believe that Annie took her own life. Critics of this theory have questioned many aspects of the reasoning, not least that if Annie had drowned herself, her jacket and bag could not have ended up so close to her body. In order to test this theory, Hazel Martin asked oceanographer Jack Gregorius for his opinions. Jack went further. He discovered that the water on Prestwick Beach is incredibly shallow, and that Annie would have had to walk around half a mile out to be out of her depth. He decided to conduct an experiment. Starting at the exact spot on which Annie was allegedly seen on the evening of December 3rd, and ensuring the conditions were as close to that day as possible, Jack placed a body of the exact size and weight of Annie into the water, along with a bag and jacket which shared the same characteristics as Annie's own possessions. He attached tracking devices to all three items, and then waited to see where the tide and current would take them. To everyone's surprise, within an hour, all 3 items had been returned to shore, although they were scattered along the beach. By high tide, however, something even more surprising had happened. Annie's replica body had been deposited near the seawall, with her bag only a couple of feet to one side and her jacket a couple of feet to the other side. Annie, though, was a strong swimmer, which cast doubt as to whether she could have drowned. Pathologist Dr. Stuart Hamilton explains, "To be able to hold your head underwater for long enough for you to drown simply voluntarily would be almost impossible." He went on to say that he, an expert in cases of drowning, had never come across a case of a woman deliberately drowning herself. Dr. Kerry Nixon is a forensic psychologist who works with the police. When we look at stats, women taking their life by walking into the sea is exceptionally rare, and therefore, if it's rare, you shouldn't come to the conclusion that the woman has taken her own life quickly. She went on to say that in most cases of deliberate drowning, the victim will remove their shoes and socks and place them on the beach before entering the water. Which begs the question, why would Annie wear her coat and carry her bag with her, as well as keep her shoes on, if she intended to end her life? She was murdered elsewhere. Annie's family were not content with the ruling and set about trying to find answers themselves. They decided to order further testing privately to test tissues from Annie's body. The results were startling. The tests centered around diatoms, microscopic algae which are present in any body of water. If someone struggles in the water, they will breathe in and swallow water with these diatoms present. However, under analysis, the diatoms found in Annie's bone marrow came from fresh water, not salt water, suggesting that Annie may have drowned in a non-marine environment. To make absolutely certain, Dr. Kirsty Scott, an environmental forensic analyst, studied diatoms taken from Prestwick Beach and compared them to the ones found in Annie's bone marrow. The differences were clear. Annie's diatoms did not come from Prestwick Beach. However, another specialist who also studied the samples said that Annie may simply have drunk tap water which had the freshwater diatoms in, debunking, to a degree, that this algae was definitive proof of a crime. When Annie's family went back to the Swedish authorities with the results, they requested further tissue samples so they could have more testing done. They wanted definitive answers. The Swedish authorities refused. Could Annie have been murdered by drowning at a different location and moved to Prestwick Beach to make her death look like nobody else was involved? In which case, by whom? Martin Leslie, imposter. When police looked into Martin Leslie, the famous ex-Scottish rugby player who had spent time with Annie, they discovered something odd. He had returned to New Zealand in 2003 and had never met or even heard of Annie Börjesson. So who did Annie meet in Mood nightclub? Annie was attracted to the rugged rugby type, so did this man, whoever he was, use that to his advantage in order to deceive her? Annie told her family that there was something very off about this man. Had he been stalking Annie? After all, he turned up at the rugby club where she was spending the evening, following her brief visit home, and even appeared at her swim club, unannounced and uninvited. Annie had said that she became scared of him after he gave her a mean look in the rugby club. Was he mean enough to murder the 30-year-old Swedish Annie? Police never managed to track down this mysterious man, so his involvement remains a mystery. CIA. While it sounds like something you might find on Netflix, there are enough factors in this case to at least consider the possibility that Annie was murdered by the CIA in a case of mistaken identity. She shared her middle and last name with Christina Börjesson, who was well known by the American Secret Services as someone who exposed the movement of suspected terrorists through Prestwick Airport on the way to prisons like Guantanamo Bay. Annie had expressed concern that someone was tracking her through her computer and phone, and told her family not to call her on her mobile phone, as someone might be listening. Annie's phone records are also a huge red flag. Even if she deleted her call history on her phone, her call log would still have been accessible to her provider. However, an agency like the CIA would have the power to wipe the records clean. When Annie went to the airport on her way back to Sweden, she hadn't yet booked her flight. Her family said this wasn't unusual, and she would often buy a last-minute ticket. But when Annie went to the ATM to withdraw cash, she found she didn't have enough money in her account. Did the person who wiped her phone records also hack her bank account, so she had no access to funds? Annie had every intention of flying home to Sweden that day. She had her passport, as well as books which were to be returned to a library in Sweden. She had also booked a hair appointment and had even paid her rent a month in advance. Was Annie's hair cut by an assailant in a bid to make her look like the other Kristina Börjesson when they perhaps realized they had murdered the wrong person? In a further twist, Sky News journalist Robert Mulhern requested access to all correspondence between Scottish and Swedish authorities regarding Annie's death. The Swedish embassy refused, saying that to release any documents would cause harm to their relations with a foreign state. Furthermore, the Swedish government has labelled the case as a classified state secret. While many things remain unanswered in Annie Börjesson's case, it does appear that her mental health had been spiralling in the days and weeks leading up to her death. Nobody could trace the man who Annie said was Martin Leslie, and nobody could recall seeing the two of them together. Annie claimed that he had been in the rugby club, yet nobody remembers seeing him, an international rugby star, in the club. He would certainly have been recognised, having played for Scotland some 37 times. Annie's contract at the Whiskey Heritage Centre had ended, and she had been unable to find another placement. Indeed, one of Annie's flatmates told investigators that Annie was depressed because she couldn't find another job, and that she appeared lonely. Another flatmate admitted that she had had to move out of the flat because Annie was too intense and pushy. A third flatmate recalled Annie telling her that she had made a life-changing decision just 3 days before she died. The now-retired detective Michael Neal said, "The pictures that we were getting from the people we were speaking to was that Annie's life in Scotland was completely different to the life her family were led to believe she was leading. She was depressive, she had low mood, she was obsessive. A couple of times we had people saying that she was obsessed with them. This observation seems to have some truth in it." A local man who owned a shop in Edinburgh told police that Annie would often stop by for a chat, but that she would stay for hours, describing her as unconventional and lost in life. Of course, this could just be put down to a chatty woman seeking conversation with a friendly local. Things soon became a little darker, though. The shop owner told police that he had been at home one night when the door opened and Annie walked into his house without knocking. When he questioned her about how she knew where he lived, she admitted that she had followed him home. It's entirely feasible that Annie didn't want her family to know that her life in Edinburgh was falling apart and was presenting one story to them, while her life was in fact the total opposite. But a decline in mental health and the decision to end her life would not explain the bruising and other anomalies between the Scottish and Swedish reports. Police said that the bruising may have just been too faint at the time of the initial investigation and deepened over time, and that she would have sustained injuries as her body was pummeled in the sea and rolled over the sand by the waves. There would also have been blood pooling, known as lividity, which can look like bruising. Perhaps the post-mortem lividity made any bruising seem worse than it was. This was ruled out by undertakers Gun Daneberg and Lennart Svensson, who would of course be well versed in the difference between trauma and blood pooling post-mortem. It seems strange that a young woman intent on taking her own life would travel first to an airport and then leave within a few minutes. We know that Annie tried to withdraw cash before catching a flight home, but didn't have sufficient funds in her account. Was that the last straw in an already troubled mind? If Annie was pinning all her hopes on going home for the holiday, finding that she couldn't afford the ticket might have pushed her over the edge, compelling her to walk to a nearby beach to put an end to her suffering. Or is there more than a grain of truth in Annie's claim that she was being tracked? Had somebody scared Annie so much that she felt the only way out was to take her own life? Whatever led to Annie's death seems to have taken place in those 3 minutes when she was in the car park of Prestwick Airport, but without CCTV and no witnesses, nobody knows what happened in that brief but pivotal window of time. There are, without a doubt, many questions left unanswered about how and why Annie Kristina Börjesson died, and the fact that both the Scottish and Swedish government refused access to photos and other information only adds to the suspicion that something sinister happened. Were they trying to cover up procedural mistakes in the investigation rather than evidence of a murder? There were certainly errors made right from the start. For example, the police wrongly put her age as 31 when she was in fact 30. A seemingly minor error for sure, but was that mistake indicative of more serious errors that they wanted to cover up? Until those case files are made available, we, and more importantly the Börjesson family, may never know the answers as to why a bright, vivacious 30-year-old's body was found on Prestwick Beach on that cold winter's morning.